Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski. Today we're talking with Lanae Strovers and Melissa Posey Luce about how to make funerals meaningful for children and youth in attendance. As experienced funeral directors, Lanae and Melissa have experienced firsthand how the death of a loved one can affect children, and how involving them in the funeral or memorial service can help them move forward on their unique grief journey. Young mourners can often feel a bit lost at a funeral, but there are meaningful ways to help them say goodbye to their loved one and to honor their grief. We're going to explore some of those today. Welcome, Lanae and Melissa. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Holly.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Absolutely. In terms of kids, we think that children are more resilient than adults following the death of a loved one, especially if they don't always show their grief outwardly. Do you find, is that always the case?
I don't think that's always the case at all. In fact, I think that a lot of times we don't see the effects of that grief until years down the road. It really depends on what developmental stage they're in, but it is important to recognize that is there and really be on the lookout for the signs of grief.
I'm sure that it's probably an age-appropriate question, but is it important for children and young people to actually attend funerals, and why is it important?
It is absolutely important for children to have the choice to attend a funeral, and this is because oftentimes we don't really see some of their grief. And a lot of times children think in terms that are very concrete, and a lot of times adults don't, right? So if someone says, for example, someone passed away. I was just with a group of children this weekend working on an initiative about funerals, and it was interesting that that term was used by an adult, and the child came back and said, well, that sounds like something you do on the road. Didn't someone just die? So to have a child attend an actual funeral or memorial service or celebration of life, or even be involved in the planning of that, really helps, make it a concrete experience for them and let them recognize exactly what happened.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, too. I think, sometimes when a grandparent or someone who's maybe been in a nursing home for a long time or been in the hospital for a long time, and especially now with COVID, if they haven't been able to visit that person and then they die, sometimes they don't understand that that person has died. And if they're not able to go to the funeral, it's like there's never that end point for them. And so it's very important for children to go so they understand that that person died and be able to have those feelings to remember that special person, but also to know that that person died instead of just that it's kind of floating out there and never have that closure for them.
That is such a good point, Lanae.
It brings up a really good point of how to approach explaining to a young child, maybe a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, that Grandpa has died. We often try to soften the blow by saying, oh, Grandpa fell asleep, but then they might be afraid of falling asleep and never waking up again. So how do you tell a child that they have lost a loved one?
I think the one thing that I stand by is honesty is the best policy, and that's the one thing that we always say is never use the word sleep. We don't want a child to be afraid of, like you said, to fall asleep themselves and to associate that with death. Or if their parents fall asleep, we don't want them to put those two things together. And so when you're telling a young child that someone has died is to use the right terminology, use the word death, use the word died, and be very honest with that so that they're not mixing up different terms, even though it sounds softer at the time. It's the long-term effects of that is going to be more complicated.
Yes, I would totally agree with that, Lanae. That is so true. And I wanted to add, too, after you use all that honest, simple language with them, it's important to step back and just listen. Also, a lot of times they have a real need to be heard, and they're going to give you a cue as to what they're ready to receive on your end, what they're ready to attend, what they're ready to see. They have a real innate sense of that. So it's important to really listen, both physically and with your, eyes, with your ears and eyes, to what they're saying.
And sometimes with that, with that age group, too, is we'll even explain it so simply as what is the difference between living and dying, and you can reference it to very simple things like a flower can live and die versus a rock cannot live and die, and really compare it to things that are very simplistic to that child's learning level, and that's another way that you can make it so simple but on their level that they can understand what that means.
So it's really up to parents to decide where their children are emotionally and in terms of maturity as to how to explain it. And children are they're so impressionable. Do you think that first grief experience, that first loss, might set the tone for how they grieve moving forward through the rest of their life?
I absolutely know that is the case. And I say this with assurance because I think about this family that came into our funeral home about 10 years ago. And about 60 years prior to that, my grandfather had been the funeral director for their family. And the woman who came in was actually a child at the time when that family was first served. And that was her first experience. And it set the tone. And she confirmed to my grandfather, first of all, thank you for the service that you rendered. But, you helped me make it see that it didn't have to be such a scary experience. It was something that really happened. It was sad, and you were there to support us. And that just started a whole relationship. It transcended into other areas of her life, but that first experience was so important, and I was so grateful that it had been handled properly, and she was too. So yes, both the grown-ups in the child's life and then the professionals in the industry, like funeral directors, can help shepherd that experience and really make it a good first impression for them.
Do you find any value in involving children in the planning of a funeral?
I think definitely. I think a lot of times when families come to make arrangements, a lot of times they decide to leave, younger children at home. And there's definitely certain circumstances where that's appropriate. But in some circumstances, when they do bring children to arrangements, I think it can be beneficial, especially if it's maybe a sibling who passed away. And our job as a funeral director to be able to ask that sibling, what was your brother or sister's favorite color? Or, what were some games that you guys like to play? Or what was your favorite snack? Things that can make them feel involved in that, and also because they just had a loss of a sibling, or maybe it was their grandma and they had a very close relationship with them, to make them feel that their relationship was important and validated. And that way it also has something that you can then, when they come back for that first view in that funeral, you can make something special for them to make them know that they were heard during that time. And I think it's just something that you can do to validate their loss as well.
Might it be helpful for children to plan and lead a memorial service after the more traditional funeral is held? And how can you as a funeral director help facilitate that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that this could be very beneficial. While it's not something that's traditionally done or widely done, I think it's something to consider. And why is that? That's because children need that opportunity to be heard. And to grieve in their own space, which is a unique space. A funeral director can absolutely help facilitate this. It could be something as simple as a little service that's held maybe when the family gets together for a meal after that more formal service. It could also be something like in a park, a day or two after, if the family felt that direction was needed and leadership was needed by a professional to help put that together. Or it could be something simple, like an art display, and a child walks their attendees, which could be their friends, their pets even, through what they've drawn or depicted through clay or something like that. It's just very important for children to be given the choices of how they want to memorialize the person that they loved or the pet that they loved who has passed away.
Lanae, I understand you've worked with terminally ill children in planning their own memorial service. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this has been a very unique and beautiful experience that I've been able to to be a part of. I have been blessed to work with some amazing social workers here in the area, and they have introduced me to families of children that are terminally ill, and we have been able to sit down with these children that they know that they're going to die. And instead of keeping this hush-hush secret from them, we've been able to sit down and, I visit with them and we talk about what they want for their funeral. And we don't use the term funeral, but we talk about their celebration. What kind of a party do we want for them? And it's not a sad thing. I've met with young kids as young as 4 or 5 that talk about this one little boy, he wanted superheroes. And we have this amazing group of Iowa League of Heroes here that dress up as superheroes. And so they were here at his funeral and they were his pallbearers. And that was his wishes, and we were able to make that come true. There have been older kids that were in their teens that they, helped write their own obituaries and, picked out their own clothes and shared what they wanted. And when you create these relationships with the families and you get to know the parents and you get to know the kids, when that time comes, when the parents are handing off their child to you, you've already created this bond of trust. And they're not handing their child over in one of the most horrible days of their life to a stranger, but you've already formed this friendship, and it makes the whole process so much easier. And they also know they're doing what their child wanted, and it's a beautiful experience instead of this terrible experience.
Wow, that's amazing. I commend you for that work. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's quite something. It's one of those things where you think it's going to be so hard, and it is. It's hard to watch that, but you know that you're just giving this beautiful gift to the family to walk them through that.
Right. You both have good examples of how you have incorporated children and made it more meaningful for them. And I'll come to you in a minute, Lanae, but Melissa, can you talk about the camp that you developed for children who have experienced the death of a primary caregiver?
Oh, yeah, I would be happy to do that. We partnered with a local YMCA. Actually, they have about 25 locations in the area that we live in. And we also partnered with the Children's Hospital of Georgia, and we produced this camp in conjunction with some additional hospice associations. This was a camp for children who had experienced the death of a primary caregiver within the last 12 months. And we did this last summer, last August. So that was interesting because a lot of these children came having experienced the grief that's very unique to COVID and the situations around that. It was a wonderful opportunity for these children to gather together in community, to feel like they weren't alone in their experiences, and to really talk and have fun together, but have some therapeutic things intermixed throughout the day. They did things like rock climbing. They got to kayak on a lake. In between those types of things, though, they did meet with some grief counselors. They made masks, for example, and on the outside of that mask, they drew and decorated with what they thought other people saw when they looked at them. And then on the inside of the mask, they put things that were very unique to them and their feelings. We saw all kinds of things. We saw angry words. We saw, of course, sad faces, tears, all of that. So they were able to take those things home and share them with their families. At the end of the day, because this year it was a day camp due to COVID, they made rocks and painted these memory rocks and created a rock garden there at this camp. So that's going to be something that we'll add to. It was just a wonderful opportunity for, like I said, for them to come together with kids their own age, but to also feel the love and support of very specific adults within the community.
Sounds like a wonderful healing experience for those kids. And Lanae, you like to personalize services for each person, and particularly the youth. From turning the funeral home into a baseball field, a gaming room, a classy runway show with a pianist, whatever you can do to make that service unique. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's just one thing that I've learned in this It doesn't always have to be a stuffy chapel where it's just the funeral flowers and the organ music, where we can really take an opportunity to make it personalized, and you can almost make it fun. Where, I've had different kids who've loved baseball, and so where you walk in and you start at home plate, and then you go to first base, and that's one station of their life, and then you walk the baseline to second base, and so on and so forth, and have popcorn and make it that way. And we've also turned it into where it was one kid's room, where we had an Xbox where kids could stop and play the kid's favorite Xbox games, and we had different board games that he loved and different things like that. So we're really encompassing what those kids loved, and set up different stations where kids can color and play puzzles and things like that. So it's more interactive, and I feel like that also makes kids feel more comfortable in the funeral home, and it's not this scary, stuffy building. Another thing that we do to help make kids feel more comfortable, especially around maybe the body, is we will have a lot of times where kids can sign the casket. And that will encourage people to come up and get closer to the body. And we really feel, especially with teenagers, they'll come up, they will spend some time putting their emotions into writing a note in their final farewell to a friend, and getting a little bit closer, where a lot of times you see where maybe kids want to hover in the back, but when they see that people are writing on that casket, they come closer. It helps them with that grieving process to physically say goodbye in that way. And so that's something that we really try and strive to make things personalized for each family, and just do those little extra touches.
Very unique. And speaking of after the funeral, what happens after that funeral is over? Do either of you work with children after funerals to help them begin their long-term grief journey?
So we at Hamilton's, we have an amazing section of the funeral home, which is called the Academy of Grief and Loss. And what is amazing with that group is they will go into schools and do some follow-up grief work. Another thing that we have is some different camps that we do. They're not overnight, but we will do ages, some young ages, that is like 3.5-year-olds to 6-year-olds, little hands, and then we do Healing Hearts, which is 6 to, I believe, 9-year-olds, that we get them together and talk about their special person and help them talk about what the funeral meant to them, what questions they had about the funeral, and kind of do a debriefing after that. And it's so interesting what the kids' take on that was, what everything meant. And so that's a lot of follow-up that we do, which is wonderful. So that's a great program that we have. We team up with different positions in the funeral home. So we have the academy, we have a funeral director, and then we also have volunteers within the community that help with that.
And I'd like to add to that, I have heard from a lot of educators around the country and counselors that they are lacking resources. So to utilize a funeral director or a funeral home like that Lanae represents is wonderful. If they would consider inviting these people with their resources to come in and partner with them, I think there's a great opportunity for our community to support these children in their grief.
What resources are available for parents and other guardians who might have questions about involving kids in funerals or in grieving?
I wanted to mention on the Remembering a Life website, there is a whole tab that speaks to the Youth and Funerals Initiative that the Funeral Service Foundation has provided, and there's some wonderful resources there. There are videos, there are booklets, e-booklets that you can see. There's topics like discussing death and funerals, youth involvement and memorialization, lots of good information to really help families have the discussion and open the doors to know what to do when a funeral happens, to let children know what they might see. There's a lot of great things like that. And then for after the funeral, I know Lanae has some good offerings as well to mention.
Yeah, so we also at Hamilton's, we have the Academy, and on our website, we have incredible resources. We have a lending library. We have tons of resources on our website, too, that are open to the public. And what's great about those is it spans from, how to talk to children about what suicide is, to how to explain cremation to children, how to take care of yourself as an individual, how to take care of yourself as a caretaker before and after a death occurs. There's so many different resources, which is great. We even span into how to handle the death of a pet. A death of a pet sometimes for children is harder than a death of a grandparent sometimes, and so we really span all of that. And so we have a lot of those resources as well. And it's not something that we keep, that's just for our funeral home, but that is for everybody to access and to use.
Very valuable indeed. I have a question for each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Melissa. Who are you remembering today?
It's interesting that you asked me that question. Just last night I was on a walk with our dogs, and I saw this large buck standing on the side of the road. And I was going through a moment where I needed to reflect upon what kind of strength I needed for some things in my life that are challenging me. So today, and when I saw that last night, and I continue to think about this today, he reminded me of my grandparents and their love for me and their confidence in me. And so today I'm remembering my grandfather and grandmother, Dudley and Marie Posey.
Lanae, who are you remembering today?
I would say my Aunt Laura Hessing. She passed away almost 20 years ago, and she was a grade school teacher, and she was diagnosed with cancer. And when she knew that she was going to die, she spent most of her time making sure that her students understood what was going to happen when she died. And that was far before I knew I was going to be in the funeral industry. And once I got into the funeral industry, that stuck with me so strongly, and it made me realize it was so important to explain to children the process, what was going to happen, and that changed my whole outlook on how I wanted to be a funeral director from what she did as a teacher.
Lanae and Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today and for the very unique and important work that you do to ensure that even our youngest mourners are acknowledged and valued and involved when someone they love has died.
Thank you so much for having us today and recognizing the importance of remembering that children are those lost mourners oftentimes, and remembering that they need the experiences just as we as adults do for support, love, and comfort.
Yes, thank you as well. I think the children are just as important as the adults, if not more important. We have such an impression as death care workers to help them, and we need to acknowledge their grief as well, and to talk about it and to be aware of that is so, so important.
And thanks to all of you for joining me today. For more information about involving children in funeral or memorial services, visit rememberingalife.com.